change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
Last week, we saw all 12 tribes of Israel. They're finally getting settled in their new tribal territories, in these new places that will become their new homes. But there's still some business here that needs to be settled before they're all dispersed while they're still together at Shiloh. And so the Lord speaks to Joshua and he tells him that the people, they need to set aside these cities of refuge, the cities that God has been speaking about for a while, because he's already spoken to the nation about setting aside these special cities of refuge. He's mentioned it already 4 times, long before they ever crossed over the Jordan into the land of Canaan. And you can find all of God's instructions for these cities back in Exodus 21 and in Numbers 35, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and Deuteronomy chapter 19. So Israel, they were to set aside these 6 cities, 3 on each side of the Jordan River, 3 on the east side and 3 on the west side. And when you think about these early days of Israel, you kind of need to realize that this is a new frontier. This is the very beginning of a new nation. And I would say for its day, it was a big nation. And it kind of reminds me of our nation in its early days. Though Israel, it's a much smaller country than our country, where it's only about the size of the state of Maryland. But for these times, during these days, this is a lot of land. And now this land is all under the control of one people. So it's not these little city kingdoms that were all around them that they had just replaced. And so the way I kind of think of this as being like the Old West, where our country began, where we had these hostile Indian tribes scattered throughout our country as our land was being settled. But America, it was under one united people. It was one country. And where we had like a federal government that gave us a national identity, we also had different territories that ended up becoming the 50 states. But Israel here, they're basically like having 12 states, the territories that made up of their 12 independent tribes. And so the way I think of this is that you have this new frontier, which is kind of like the Old West, and now you have all these places and you have these new settlers. And you still have some hostile tribal savages, and they're all living in the outskirts of your land, and they're still once in a while trying to attack you and steal your stuff as you're trying to build your community. In your towns, it's all made up of families. And here, they're mostly your families or they're your distant cousins, and everybody has their own family homestead. And they're basically trying to raise their cattle and they're trying to work their farms, and all of this is new. And you don't have a local sheriff. You actually have no law enforcement, but you have all of these written laws that you're all bound to. But you have no local law enforcement to execute these laws. So each community here, they're kind of on their own. And most things they can kind of figure out for themselves. The things like property crimes or even the crimes of passion where Mr. Peabody's getting a little familiar with Mrs. Jones or maybe some of the young folks like Bobby Joe and Becky Sue, they're spending too much time together unchaperoned and getting themselves in trouble. In each town, they would have their own town council, which would have been the elders that could settle these disputes. But if a man killed a man, and if it wasn't clear that it was a premeditated murder, or if it was maybe just an unfortunate event, maybe just an accident, there was nothing local put into place to resolve it. There was no local sheriff with the authority to carry on an investigation. But it was the responsibility of each individual family to make sure that that death in their family was avenged. And it was up to them to carry out their own justice. And to a family, if any of their loved members were killed, it was always wrong. And they weren't going to carry out an investigation. They're not going to wait to find out if it was an accident, because to them, the family's honor was at stake. And in every family, they had an avenger, but it wasn't like a superhero avenger. It was an avenger of blood, where in Hebrew it's called the Goel. And so there's a representative from every victim's family who was duty bound and is charged to make sure that justice is carried out. And this duty usually fell upon the oldest son. And the reason for this is because in Moses' law, it said that the people who shed blood, that they're to pay for their crime in their own blood. And then to have a land with unpunished murderers, that it defiled the land. And you have to see here that revenge killing is ancient, and it was also very, very common. You still see this kind of vengeance killing in modern gang warfare. Like if you kill one of ours, we're going to go kill one of yours. And you still see it in the societies of the Middle East. And you see it in literature. You see it like in Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet, feuds going on, and the Hatfields and the McCoys. So this is old. This is an old way of dealing with killing somebody from your family. So now let's say you're playing t-ball on a Sunday afternoon, and now the bat, it slips out of your hands and it accidentally strikes the person behind you and it kills them. And that's the kind of examples that it gives in the law. It's like it gives examples of you're out chopping wood and the axe head flies off and kills somebody, or else you just kind of push somebody accidentally and then they fall off a cliff, or you toss something to your friend, but instead of catching it, it strikes him and kills him. But you had no intent. He's your friend. And it's just an accident. And if that happens to you, you don't try to stand around and explain it to anyone. What you do is you start running, because the clock starts ticking. Because when that avenger of blood finds you and he finds out you killed his relative, he's honor bound to kill you. And he's not going to ask you any questions. He's not going to see if it was your fault. So this is kind of like the movie Fugitive with Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. Tommy Lee Jones, he's not going to ask you any questions. He's going to kill you first, and then he's going to ask you questions. And it's just like he said in the movie. He says, "I don't care." And he just looks at it. "I don't care." They don't care. And so back to our old Western scenario. So now you have this posse. They're going to try to string you up, and they're going to try to lynch you before you get to Dodge City and have your fair trial. So you got to get to Dodge. But in Israel, Dodge City, it's actually 6 cities. And on the west side of the Jordan River, in the far north in the Galilee area, and Naphtali, in the Naphtali territory, Dodge City is actually called the city of Kadesh. And then on the west side of the Jordan, in the middle of Israel, it's the city of Shechem. And then on the west side of the Jordan, in southern Judah, it's called the city of Hebron. And then there's also 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan River, and it's the city of Golan in Manasseh's territory, and Ramoth in Gad's territory, and Bezer in Reuben's territory. And your only hope to live is to get to one of these cities before the Avenger of Blood catches you. So this is a lot like the game of tag. And you got to get to base before you get tagged. And the city of refuge is base. And so when you look at this system that God has put in place for his people, you can see that God is doing everything possible so that nobody is killed for an accident. Because God makes a big difference between accidental killings and murder. Because a killing without premeditation or without malice, where you don't hate your enemy, it's not murder, it's just manslaughter. But that doesn't mean that there are no consequences. But the person who killed somebody by accident, they need to be protected. And you might think, and you might say, well, doesn't the 10 Commandments say, "Thou shalt not kill"? And in some translations, that's what it says. but it actually says in the Hebrew and in the Greek, it says, thou shalt not murder. And so God's plan is to scatter these 6 cities throughout Israel because, like we said, Israel is only about the size of the state of Maryland, and that anyone could reach one of these cities within a half a day's journey. And according to Deuteronomy 19, the roads to these cities, they had to be cared for by the Levites, and their bridges had to be maintained and crossable because they have to make it easy for the fugitive to be able to get there. And all of these cities are Levitical cities. So your case is going to be handled by the Levites. And they're all instructed in these kind of laws to be able to protect the person. And as you're running to one of these cities and you're in fear for your life and you're trying to keep ahead of the avenger of blood, they would have Levites posted outside of the city limits. And they were just there just to be able to encourage you to run, to tell you things like, hey, you're almost there. Just keep going. You can make it. And cheering you on so you don't give up hope. And then when you would enter that city, you would be welcomed by the elders who all hang out at the gates of the cities, because that's where the elders hung out. And they would take you in and they would comfort you and they'd give you a place to live, and it would all be provided for you. And this was a safe place to stay while your case is being investigated. But this wasn't a safe place to stay if you actually murdered someone, because this wasn't a place that was soft on murder. So this wasn't just some liberal city that's going to be easy on crime. So it's not like you can run there and get away with murder, because if you committed a murder, you'd be executed right away. You would be turned over to the avenger of blood. So I don't think OJ, he would have wanted to show up at one of these cities. I don't think that would have worked out for him. But if it was manslaughter and you caused an accidental death and you didn't commit murder, you were safe. And the Levites, they wouldn't hand you over to the avenger of blood. But it also meant that that city, whichever city you picked and that you ran to, that city would also become your new home. Because in that city, that was the only place where you would be safe. And even after the investigation, and even after they found out you being innocent of murder, you still had to remain in that city to be safe. Because if you went outside of that city and the avenger of blood found you, you were no longer under the city's protection. The avenger of blood could kill you. And that was the way it's going to be for the rest of your life, unless the high priest died. Because if the high priest died while you're living in the city of refuge, you'd be able to go home. And the avenger of blood, he still wasn't allowed to touch you. All right, now some people, they see Jesus Christ as our city of refuge, where the sinner, as a sinner, you're always in danger of the judgment of death. And where the avenger of death, he's always running after us. But you can flee to Jesus to protect you. And so there's a little lesson here that if you have not fled to Jesus, well, that means you're not safe and you will die. And there is no other place and there is no other city ever provided that you can run to be safe from death. And that's because salvation is only found in Jesus. And then there's this part that I'm really not sure about because I didn't read it anywhere, but I actually think there's kind of something about the high priest's death here. Because after his death, that means you can go home. And then you look at this and you say, well, this world, this is not our home. We're just kind of passing through here. But with Jesus' death, who is our high priest, we can go home, and we will. But until we go home to the place that God has prepared for us, we will be safe in our city of refuge, which is Jesus. So we will be safe here on earth as long as we stay in Jesus. But if we go outside of Jesus and we start doing things outside of Christ, and we go outside of our city of refuge, the things of the world, he won't protect us from the avenger of death. All right. So now chapter 22, it begins, and they're all still up in Shiloh. And now the leaders of the Levites are coming to Eleazar, the high priest, and to Joshua, and they're asking for these cities that Moses had promised them. Now, we had just spoke of 6 of their cities, those 6 cities of refuge, but the Levites were to receive 48 cities total, and they're all scattered throughout Israel, and they're on both sides of the Jordan River. And that is so that there would be a godly influence everywhere in Israel, because the people back then, they didn't have personal copies of the scriptures, but all the Levites would have been taught in the scriptures. And so that's not much different of how God has us as Christians scattered throughout the whole world, that where we can have a godly influence on the people we're around. Where they say, some people say, you may be the only Bible that somebody ever reads. And so you don't find us as Christians trying to have our own big Christian country or our own Christian state. We don't just gather in big groups of Christians, but we're to be scattered so that we can have an influence on all the places that God sends us. So we have influences in the places we work, where we go to schools, in our government offices, wherever he sends us. Because the truth is that we are all in ministry, and God places us in the areas that he thinks is best for us to influence others. And so all these 48 cities for the Levites, they're to be given by the 12 tribes of Israel. And so all the tribes, they give the Levites 4 cities, except for Judah and Simeon. They together, they actually give the Levites 9 cities. And you have to remember that Judah and Simeon, they actually share the same territorial area. The other exception is Naphtali, who only gave the Levites 3 cities from their territory. And I don't really think it's because they were cheap or anything, because they did have that one city of refuge that was Kadesh. And all of these cities, they're all assigned to the Levites by their families, by Levi, the father of the Levites, through his 3 sons. And he had 3 sons. He had Kohath, Gershom, and Merari. Now, Aaron and his sons, though they are all from the family of the Kohaths, they do have their own separate allotment. And then that's only because they're the priesthood. And all these cities for the Levites and the land surrounding them, they're all assigned by lot, the same way that the land was divided to the tribes. So this was all done by lottery. And so each city, they received land outside the city walls called the common land. And that was areas for the families to raise their herds and to grow their crops. And the land given around each city was 1,000 cubits. And that's in each direction from the end of the city limits, which would be equal to us to being about 1,500 feet. And it's on all sides of the cities. And so I'm not really a math guy, but my lame calculations would be that even if the city was like the size of a pea, you would still have 206 acres for each side of the city. But if the city grew, that would mean that the land would also grow with it, because the distance of those 1,000 cubits, it was all based on the city walls from where they were at. And you might look at that and you might think, hey, that's a lot of land for these people. But the count for the Levites, we find it in Numbers chapter 26, and it says that there were 23,000 men who were under the age of 50. So that means that all these people have to fit inside of all these 48 cities. So those cities had to have been pretty well populated. And now the Levites, they also had special rules for the selling of their properties. They were allowed to be able to sell their houses in the city, but they weren't allowed to be able to sell their common lands. And they also had these different rules about redeeming their houses. They had more opportunities to buy back properties that they sold. All right, so now we get to chapter 22, and we're starting to get close to the end of the book of Joshua. And we see that all the wars now, they're ended, and all of the property's been divided. And you would have to think that all these people, they had to have been excited about being able to go to their new homes. And especially, you would think, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, because they'd been away from their families now for 7 years. But this would have also been a very emotional time, because you're leaving all your brothers in arms and all those men that you fought side by side with, and you know that you're not going to be seeing them anytime soon. You might be seeing them at reunions, because there will be reunions, because every year the men were to appear before the tabernacle 3 times a year, and at this time was in Shiloh. So for these 3 feasts, they'd have to show up. But I don't think they're thinking about that right here. I think they're thinking about how things are going to be different. And I think they're going back, and they're going back to crossing that Jordan River again. And they're realizing that river, that this divides them from their brothers. This is dividing them from the rest of Israel. And I'm thinking that they may be thinking that as they're going home that, well, this is what we chose. And at the time when they chose it, that, well, we had never seen the promised land. You know, when we asked for that land on the other side of the Jordan. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them regretted it, because now they know that they're going to be a little separated, and they're going to be distanced from the family. And it's kind of like us when we move away from our family. You're still family, but you're not seeing them that often. Doesn't mean you don't love them immensely, but you do become more distant than if you had remained at home. So now you have Joshua here, who's a good commander, and we know he's a lot older now. And now he's sending them away with a blessing and telling them how great they did, how faithful they were in carrying out every word that Moses had commanded him. And you can tell he's proud of them. And he reminds them here, he says, remember, obey the Lord. And mostly, he says here, to love the Lord, because that's to be their motivation in serving God. It was for them to love him. And if they loved him, then they would walk in his ways. And then they would do it with all their heart and all their soul. And these are the promises that they had made at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And it's kind of like you can see Joshua out there waving goodbye as a family's pulling out with their station wagon with all the kids waving back. And Joshua being like this grandfather, sending the kids away with this big bag of candy and saying, hey, go back and share it with the other kids. And where Joshua says, hey, share all your spoils you received with your brothers and sisters back home, all that gold and silver and iron, all those clothes from the battles, because that's for them too. And so this so much feels like a family saying goodbye to each other. It's more than just, a people dispersing after a war. But it didn't take very long, because they hadn't even crossed the Jordan yet, where in verse 11 it says, now the children of Israel heard someone say, and we have no idea who said it, because that's always the way it is with gossip. And it always seems that it was someone heard someone say,
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,